The call came late on Christmas Eve, a night that should have been filled with warmth, family, and that quiet, hopeful excitement. I was working a shift in a rural county, and that night would sear itself into my memory with a horror I'll never shake. The air was so cold it made my teeth ache, and out in the county the darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint twinkle of Christmas lights on distant farmhouses. The dispatch was for a car accident, nothing unusual, especially on a holiday when icy roads and too much holiday cheer can mix badly. But there was a tightness in the dispatcher's voice, a tone I've learned means something terrible is waiting. I remember the drive vividly, the ambulance's red and white lights slicing through the black, the steady hum of tires on the frozen road clashing with the dread building in my chest. We were among the first to arrive, but even from a distance, the scene felt sickeningly wrong. A single car, twisted and mangled, had veered off the road and slammed into a massive oak tree. When I cut the engine, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind whispering through bare branches and the faint hiss of the car's cooling engine. The real horror hit when I reached the driver's side. The metal was peeled back like some grotesque advent calendar, revealing something unthinkable. A woman was trapped inside, her body unnaturally still. It was the injury to her head that stopped me cold, a detail so horrific it seemed to warp the night itself. The back of her skull had a massive wound, a gaping hole the size of a grapefruit. Blood, dark and thick under the flashing emergency lights, was everywhere, painting the car's interior in nightmarish streaks. Brain matter, such a cold, clinical term for something so human, was splattered across the dashboard and the shattered windshield. I'd seen death before, plenty of times. It's part of the job, grim as that is. But this was different. This was a brutal, violent horror on a night meant for joy. My training took over, an automatic reflex from years of high-stress calls. I had to stabilize her head, a grim task, even though the injury was clearly catastrophic. As I leaned in, the freezing night air met the impossible heat still radiating from the wound, creating a visible vapor like a ghostly steam rising from the chasm in her skull. That image, the heat, the steam, the raw, visceral reality of that injury just inches from my face, became the anchor of the horror, a detail my mind would replay endlessly in the weeks, months, and years that followed. My gloved hands, usually steady, trembled as I took hold. The feel of shattered bone and exposed tissue was sickening, even through the gloves. I could hear my partner's voice, distant and distorted, radioing in the grim reality, the words expectant and incompatible with life hanging heavy in the icy air. We worked, followed procedure, did what we were trained to do, but the knowledge that it was futile felt like a heavy weight. The woman, whose name I'd later learn, whose family was probably waiting for her to come home for Christmas, was beyond any help I could offer. She died right there, in the wreckage of her car, on a night meant for miracles, not for such profound, senseless loss. The aftermath blurred together, more flashing lights as other units arrived, the quiet efficiency of the coroner, the hushed, somber tones of police officers. But for me, the call didn't end when I left the scene. It kept replaying. The grotesque wound, that impossible heat, the blood staining the Christmas Eve snow that had started to fall softly around us. The holiday's emotional weight, smashed against the graphic, violent reality of her death, created a collision that was almost too much to bear. Christmas, a season I'd once loved, would never be the same. It's forever tainted by the memory of that night, the image of those rising vapors, and the crushing helplessness I felt facing such utter devastation. It was real-life trauma, a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the abyss, and it left a haunting mark that no amount of time or other calls could ever fully erase. I'm an EMT, and when the call came in, I figured it was just another routine job. An elderly man living alone had triggered his 911 medical alert. These calls are pretty common, usually falls, medication mix-ups, or sometimes just the deep loneliness that creeps in with age. My partner and I pulled up to a modest older house in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood, the kind where everyone used to know each other. It was late afternoon, the light fading, casting long, eerie shadows as we walked to the front door. We announced ourselves, and a frail voice called us inside. Upstairs, in his bedroom, we found the patient, Mr. Henderson, an elderly man. He was alert, but a bit disoriented, not in any immediate danger. He mentioned feeling dizzy, but insisted he hadn't fallen. The first thing that felt off was the emergency pendant, the button he'd need to press to trigger the alarm. It was nowhere in sight. He wasn't wearing it, and it wasn't on his nightstand or the floor by his bed. When I asked, Mr. Henderson seemed confused, patting his chest and mumbling, "It must be around here somewhere," his voice thin and papery. My partner and I started searching the bedroom, then the upstairs hallway, standard procedure. But as we moved through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't outright threatening, more like something was just off, like a radio tuned slightly off station, humming with an unsettling static beneath everything. The search took us to a spare bedroom, and that's when the off feeling intensified. The room was packed, almost floor to ceiling, with dolls of every kind. Porcelain ones with vacant staring eyes, rag dolls with stitched smiles that seemed to twist into leers in the dim light, baby dolls with faces a little too lifelike. They sat on shelves, in tiny chairs, even propped up on the bed, a silent, watchful crowd. A shiver ran down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about so many of them, their unblinking eyes seeming to track my every move. Then my partner called out, "Found it!" The emergency pendant was downstairs, on the kitchen counter, a place Mr. Henderson swore he hadn't been for hours. How could he have pressed the button from upstairs if it was down there? As we prepared to help Mr. Henderson downstairs, the two-way speaker on the medical alert base unit crackled to life. It was the monitoring service operator. "Ma'am, are the paramedics with you now? Can you confirm the patient's name?" I responded. "This is EMT McFalls. We're with Mr. Henderson. He's stable. Can you tell us who made the call? The patient doesn't remember activating the pendant, and we found it downstairs." After a pause, the operator's voice came through, clear and steady. "Our records show the call was activated by a female. She said her husband needed help and gave Mr. Henderson's name and address." My partner and I exchanged a look. "Sir," I said gently to Mr. Henderson, "the operator says a woman made the call for you. Was anyone else here? A neighbor? A family member?" Mr. Henderson looked genuinely confused, his eyes clouded with bewilderment and a hint of fear. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "There's no one else. I live alone. My Mary, my wife, she passed away 5 years ago." The hallway suddenly felt colder. My mind flashed back to the doll room, to that porcelain doll and its subtly shifted position, its cold, blue, unblinking stare. The operator was certain it was a female caller. Mr. Henderson was just as certain he was alone, and his wife, the only woman who'd call him her husband like that, had been gone for years. We took Mr. Henderson to the hospital for an evaluation, mostly as a precaution. As we left the house, I couldn't shake the image of those dolls, or the chilling gap between the operator's words and Mr. Henderson's reality. The pendant downstairs, the female voice on the line, that doll that seemed to move. Later, my partner and I admitted to each other the deep unease we'd felt in that house, a sense that something was profoundly, inexplicably wrong. We couldn't prove anything, couldn't put it in a report, But we both felt it. We hadn't been entirely alone in that house. Maybe Mr. Henderson's late wife, or something tied to her eerie collection, had reached out, blurring the line between what's real and what isn't, to get him help. It was a quiet, creeping horror, the kind that whispers in the dark and makes you question whether the world around you is as solid as you think. I'm a paramedic, and the call was just a routine patient transport, the kind we do all the time, moving someone from one hospital to another or from home to an appointment. It was night, the city lights a distant blur as we sped along a quiet highway. The patient, a middle-aged man, was stable but quiet, almost withdrawn, strapped securely to the stretcher in the back. I was in the patient area, checking vitals, while my partner drove. It started subtly. A slight chill crept into the air, even though the heater was running. I didn't think much of it at first. Ambulances aren't exactly cozy. Then, some of the stowed medical gear began to rattle just a little, like we'd hit a rough patch of road. But the highway felt smooth. I checked the cabinets. Everything was latched tight. I glanced at the patient, but his eyes were closed, his face blank. The unease grew as we kept driving. The rattling got louder, a persistent jitter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like when you're changing altitude fast. Then, a cold draft swept through the back, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I checked the door seals, the window, everything was shut tight, but the temperature was dropping, noticeably, uncomfortably cold. Suddenly, with a jolt that threw me against my seatbelt, a pack of gauze flew off a shelf like something invisible had swatted it. It landed near the patient, who flinched, his eyes snapping open, wide with fear. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice raspy. Before I could answer, I felt a sharp tug on my uniform sleeve, a clear, deliberate pull, like someone had grabbed the fabric and yanked. I spun around. Nothing. Just me and the patient, who was now staring at me, terrified. The air in the back of the ambulance felt thick, charged with something unseen. It was like the air was crackling. I've been doing this job for over 10 years, but in that moment, I felt a prickle of real fear, something I hadn't felt in ages. I tried to keep calm for the patient. "Just a bump, everything's fine," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the storm inside me. But it wasn't fine, not even close. Then came the moment that still haunts my nightmares. With a violent metallic screech and a blast of roaring wind and frigid air, the heavy rear doors of the ambulance flew open, exposing us to the dark, speeding highway. We were going over 60 miles an hour. The patient screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror. Loose items were sucked out into the night. I lunged, grabbing the stretcher to keep it secure, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The danger was real. This could have been a disaster. My partner, hearing the roar and feeling the pressure change, shouted from the front, his voice strained. "What the hell is going on back there?" He started slowing down, pulling onto the shoulder. As we fought to slam the flapping doors shut against the wind, something even more terrifying happened. The patient, who'd been rigid with fear, suddenly arched his back against the restraints. His face twisted, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. The sound was guttural, deep, laced with an ancient malice that turned my blood to ice. "Leave," it boomed, the words slicing through the wind and highway noise. "She does not want you here." We finally got the doors shut and latched, the ambulance screeching to a halt on the dark shoulder. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the patient's ragged, gasping breaths. He sounded like himself again, whimpering and trembling. My partner and I just stared at each other, horrified. We finished the transport to the hospital in tense, heavy silence. Later, while doing paperwork and trying to process what happened, we cautiously asked about the patient's background. We learned he had a history of psychiatric issues, sure, but also a persistent, chilling claim. He was being haunted, tormented by a vengeful spirit that had latched onto him after a traumatic event in his past. He'd reported poltergeist-like activity before, but nothing as violent or undeniable as this. I've always been a practical guy, not one for supernatural stuff. But what happened that night defied any logical explanation. The plummeting temperature, objects moving on their own, that tug on my sleeve, and those heavy ambulance doors, built to stay shut, flying open at highway speed, and that voice, that horrible, alien voice coming from the patient. My partner and I agreed we'd never faced anything so unexplainable, so deeply terrifying in all our years. Whatever that was in the ambulance, it wasn't just a passenger. It was an active, hostile force, turning a routine trip into a brush with something far beyond comprehension. The chill of that night clung to me long after the cold faded. The crash was pure chaos. It was a high-speed, head-on collision on a remote highway, late one rain-soaked night. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and the sharp stench of gasoline and burnt oil choked the air. First responders swarmed the scene, their movements lit by the harsh strobe of emergency lights, rain plastering their hair to their faces. I was the survivor, trapped in the driver's seat of my wrecked car, my body screaming with pain, so intense it felt like it was dragging me into a darkness I wasn't sure I'd escape. My name's David, and I was fading in and out, barely holding on. Later, much later, after they cut me out with the jaws of life, and I went through multiple surgeries, I started piecing together fragments of that awful night. Amid the chaos, the pain, and the fear, one memory stood out with startling clarity. A woman. I remembered her in what I thought was an EMT's uniform, though her face was blurry in my mind. Her voice, though, was soft, calming, like a lifeline. She appeared beside me in the wreckage, out of nowhere. While rescuers shouted and worked with loud tools, she was just there. She spoke to me, her words gentle, telling me help was here, that I wasn't alone, that I had to hold on. I felt her take my hand, her grip firm and warm against the cold steel and broken glass pinning me down. I clung to that hand, to her presence, like it was the only thing keeping me from slipping away. Weeks into my recovery, when I was stable enough, I felt this overwhelming need to thank the first responders who saved me. I especially wanted to find that woman, the EMT whose quiet strength had anchored me in those terrifying moments. I described her to the ambulance crew who'd been at the scene and later visited me in the hospital. Her calm demeanor, her reassuring words, the way she held my hand. They listened patiently, but then exchanged confused glances. They told me, gently but firmly, that no female EMT like that had been at my car. The first crew on scene was 2 male paramedics and a male firefighter who got me out. Other units arrived later, but none of the women who showed up matched the description of someone who'd been inside the car with me, comforting me before I was freed. They checked rosters, looked at assignments. There was no record, no memory from anyone of the woman I described being there at that critical moment. I was confused, then stubborn. I remembered her so vividly. Her presence had felt so real, so essential to my survival, a beacon in that storm of trauma. How could they not know who she was? I gave more details. Her approximate height, the hair color I thought I saw, the soothing tone of her voice. Still, no one from the official response matched my memory. As weeks passed, and I spoke to more people involved in my rescue and care, a strange pattern emerged. One ER nurse, a veteran, mentioned hearing similar stories. Patients in horrific accidents who described being comforted by mysterious figures, calm and reassuring, who didn't appear on any official list of rescuers. Some first responders, when pressed, shared hushed stories they'd heard. A child saved from a fire who said a kind lady in white led them out before firefighters arrived, or a drowning victim who felt strong hands pull them up, hands that didn't belong to any known rescuer. These figures offered vital comfort or help, then vanished when official help took over. The paramedics I'd first spoken to started wondering about something their training never touched. Could it be that in moments of extreme crisis, when life's hanging by a thread, something else steps in? Could my ghostly comforter have been just that? A spirit, a guardian angel, a phantom EMT drawn to my desperate need? I never found the woman I remembered. The official record never changed. She wasn't there. But in my heart, and in the quiet stories shared by other survivors, and even some veteran first responders, her presence was real. The memory of her hand in mine, her calm voice cutting through the terror, remains a deep source of comfort and proof of something inexplicable that reached me in my darkest hour. Those whispered accounts, passed between calls in hushed tones, make me believe that maybe paramedics aren't always the only ones answering the call. Sometimes, when it's needed most, comfort comes in ways that defy explanation, a ghostly hand reaching out when all seems lost.